Over 3,000 years ago, an unstoppable storm swept across the lands surrounding the Mediterranean. Cities that had once thrived were reduced to ashes. Kingdoms, once centers of trade and culture, vanished one by one as if they had never existed. In the few surviving records, one haunting phrase appears again and again: invaders from the sea. Who were they? The ancients called them the Sea Peoples, mysterious warriors sailing unfamiliar ships, wielding weapons no one had ever seen, speaking a language no one could understand. Where they came from, no one knew. But their arrival shook the entire known world. Strangely, even today, we know very little about them. Their origins remain obscure, their motives unknown, their true identity seemingly erased from history on purpose. All we know comes from the records of those who faced them, civilizations that endured the terror they brought. Were they waves of migrants forced to abandon collapsing homelands, ruthless bands of pirates, or an organized force bent on bringing down the world order of the time? More than 3,000 years have passed, yet the question remains unanswered. Archaeologists still search for scattered clues, historians still debate endlessly, and perhaps somewhere beneath the sands of time, the truth remains hidden about one of the greatest mysteries in human history. This is the story of the Sea Peoples, and of an age they plunged into the shadows of oblivion. Tonight, join Bedtime History as we follow the trail of nameless ships, unknown warriors, and forgotten chapters of history, to uncover the story that has never been fully told, the story of the Sea Peoples, who they once were, and why their shadow continues to haunt human history to this very day. To understand why the arrival of the Sea Peoples sent such shockwaves through the ancient world, we must first imagine what the Mediterranean looked like before the crisis, a world of connection, prosperity, and profound fragility. Between the 14th and early 13th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East entered an era of unprecedented development. Civilizations across the region were thriving not only in economic and technological terms, but were deeply interconnected through vast networks of trade and diplomacy. To the south, Egypt's new kingdom, under pharaohs such as Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Seti I, stood at the height of its power. Monumental temples rose along the banks of the Nile, testaments to the king's immense wealth and boundless ambition. Egyptian merchant ships sailed to distant ports, bringing back prized cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and precious stones and exotic spices from the legendary land of Punt. To the north, across the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire emerged as a formidable power. From their well-fortified capital at Hattusa, they controlled vital trade routes linking the Near East with the Balkans. The Hittites were not only skilled warriors but also master diplomats, leaving behind extensive archives of diplomatic correspondence that reveal a sophisticated world of commerce and negotiation. To the west, Mycenaean civilization dominated the Greek mainland with fortified centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These were powerful city-states capable of mobilizing large forces, known for their advanced metallurgy, and an elite class that lived in opulent palaces. From Greece, Mycenaean merchant ships spread across the Mediterranean, trading wine, olive oil, pottery, and weapons. To the east, the port cities of the Levant, Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon, served as crucial links in this regional trade network. Ugarit, in particular, flourished as a vibrant center of commerce and culture, and it was here that the world's first true alphabet, the foundation of many modern scripts, was born. Further south, the land of Canaan, which would later witness the rise of new peoples, was a region rich with potential and under the sway of the great empires. Its inhabitants actively participated in coastal trade, supplying valuable goods to larger markets. What bound all of these centers together was not just military power or wealth, but an intricate trade network spanning sea routes and overland caravans. On large ships, essential materials, especially copper and tin for making bronze, moved continuously. Archaeologists have uncovered shipwrecks like the Uluburun off the coast of modern-day Turkey, its cargo packed with treasures from across the ancient world, a vivid testament to the deep economic integration of the time. Yet this very interdependence was also a fatal weakness. When trade routes were disrupted, when a single link in the chain was broken, the entire system could unravel in a cascading collapse. Moreover, many of these civilizations, though outwardly powerful, were built upon centralized and fragile structures of authority, leaving them vulnerable to sudden shocks. No one could have foreseen that within a few short decades, an unfamiliar force from across the sea would shake this entire order to its core, triggering one of the greatest collapses in the history of human civilization. At the heart of this prosperous world was an intricate and far-reaching trade network, a system upon which every civilization in the region depended, and an invisible thread that bound their fates together. Imagine a ship leaving the port of Ugarit on a calm day. On its deck, barrels are packed with valuable copper, the prized metal mined on the island of Cyprus, famed for its rich copper deposits. Alongside the copper are rare ingots of tin, perhaps sourced from Anatolia, or from more distant lands such as the Caucasus or even the British Isles, regions that required long and perilous trade routes to bring their metals to the Mediterranean. The alloy of copper and tin, bronze, was the essential material for weapons, armor, tools, and even intricate jewelry. Without bronze, the military and economies of the great empires would falter. This was the lifeblood of the age, but this ship carried more than metals. On board were also cedar logs from the mountain forests of Lebanon, prized wood used to build warships, grand palace beams, and the coffins of the elite. There was also gold from Nubia, gemstones from Sinai, aromatic resins from the Arabian Peninsula, and purple dye extracted from sea snails, highly coveted by Eastern royal courts. Ships like this connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the islands of the Aegean. In Hattusa, the Hittites imported horses and tin while exporting early iron goods and fine textiles. In Mycenae, treasures unearthed from royal tombs reveal artifacts from as far as Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East, proof of a vibrant, interconnected world of trade. Each merchant and each ship was a tiny link in this vast network. And the network was not only a channel for goods, it was also a highway for ideas, technologies, religions, and languages. The early alphabets of Ugarit, advanced metallurgy techniques, and even ancient myths all traveled across the sea with these trading expeditions. Yet this deep interdependence also left these civilizations more vulnerable than ever. When tin supplies were blocked, when trade routes were disrupted by pirates or war, the consequences were not just the loss of a single commodity, but the potential unraveling of entire economic systems. When looking back at this period, we cannot overlook the unique role of the Bronze Age, one of the key foundations that had built the prosperous world on the eve of the coming crisis. Why bronze? And why would an entire era depend so heavily on this single alloy? At the time, iron had not yet been successfully smelted on a large and reliable scale. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the strategic material of the age. It was used to forge swords, spears, arrowheads, armor, as well as the essential tools of agriculture and construction. Without bronze, armies would lose their edge in battle, craftsmen could no longer produce fine goods, and both trade and production would grind to a halt. But here lies the crucial point. Copper and tin were not evenly distributed across the Mediterranean and Near East. To maintain a steady supply, civilizations had to establish long and complex trade routes, passing through many hands and intermediaries. Copper was mined on Cyprus, the era's largest production center, but tin, much rarer, had to be imported from distant regions. Some sources came from Anatolia or mountainous areas to the east. Some scholars even propose that part of the tin supply traveled from as far away as Central Europe or the British Isles, through intricate and perilous trade networks. For this reason, the great powers of the age were forced into mutual dependence to maintain their military and economic strength. No single kingdom possessed all the resources needed to operate independently from this shared system. This created a world where international connections were not optional. They were essential. The pharaohs of Egypt maintained skillful diplomatic relations with the Hittite kings. The Mycenaean city-states sought control over key maritime routes. Cities like Ugarit became vital hubs where merchants from across the known world met to trade goods and exchange information. We know this not only through archaeology but also thanks to surviving diplomatic correspondence, such as the clay tablets from Elamana and Ugarit, which show kings sending each other gold, copper, horses, artisans, and even royal family members to strengthen alliances. But such deep dependence came with a double edge. If one link in the chain broke, if a tin source ran dry, if a trade route was blocked by war or piracy, the entire system was at risk of cascading collapse. Modern scholars often compare the Bronze Age world to an early form of global economy, and like any global economy, it functioned smoothly when all parts worked in harmony, but was frighteningly fragile in the face of sudden shocks. At the time, few could have imagined that such shocks were already silently building. And when they finally struck, the entire world order of the Bronze Age would collapse faster than anyone had ever thought possible. But no matter how skillful the ancient kings were, and no matter how vast their trade networks, there were forces beyond human control. And the first signs of a deepening crisis began to appear, quietly, from nature itself. Modern climate research, combining data from ancient ice cores, tree ring analysis, and lakebed sediments, reveals that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries, BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a period of severe climate instability. Prolonged droughts devastated crops, especially in regions heavily dependent on agriculture, such as Canaan, the Levant, and even parts of Upper Egypt. Tree ring studies from Anatolia show years of stunted growth, clear evidence of extended water shortages. In addition, sediment layers from lakes in the Levant reveal sharply reduced rainfall cycles, a pattern that coincides with periods of social unrest recorded in ancient texts. In an economy that relied heavily on agricultural output and imported grain shipped over sea routes, the great kingdoms began to feel mounting pressure. Food became scarce, prices soared, hunger spread through the countryside. The very regions that had long supplied soldiers and laborers to the royal courts. But nature's fury did not end there. Powerful earthquakes, now confirmed by fault-line evidence, and sudden structural collapses at archaeological sites struck down key cities. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and many other centers show signs of earthquake destruction, either just before or during waves of violent attacks. Walls crumbled not from battle, but from the force of the earth itself. Storehouses were buried, once majestic temples reduced to ruins. In a world where the king's authority was tied to his ability to protect his people from the forces of nature, such disasters dealt a profound psychological blow. Beyond the physical evidence, surviving diplomatic letters also offer a vivid glimpse into the mood of the time. From clay tablets excavated at Ugarit, we read desperate pleas for help, reports of food shortages, civil unrest, and streams of migrants fleeing drought-stricken lands. These messages reveal a world cracking from within, an interdependent system that once nature was thrown into chaos, struggled to maintain any semblance of stability. It was in this context, the food supplies dwindled, natural disasters struck, and social tensions simmered, that the sea peoples would emerge. But were they the cause of this collapse, or simply an inevitable result of a world already unraveling? That question, even today, remains unanswered. But perhaps the clearest picture of a world coming undone is not found in the cracks in the earth, but in the trembling words etched into small clay tablets. Letters of desperation exchanged between kings, now unearthed from the ruins of the city of Ugarit. At the time, Ugarit was a thriving commercial hub on the coast of the Levant, serving as a vital crossroads in the region's economic network. The city was not only wealthy but also remarkably advanced in administration and writing. Here, archaeologists have uncovered more than 1,000 inscribed clay tablets, recording transactions, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence. Among them are letters that still send a chill down the spine when read today. One letter, sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus as enemy forces closed in, reads, "The enemy is at the gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and food at once, if possible. If not, I fear that Ugarit will not be able to hold out." Those simple, desperate words reflect a world once accustomed to trade and diplomatic ceremony, now thrust into a fight for survival. The letters also reveal the disruption of the trade system itself. In one message to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, the king of Ugarit complains that merchant ships can no longer dock because strange pirates have appeared off the coast, and laments that copper and tin, once reliably delivered, have failed to arrive. Taken together, these scattered details reveal a regional economy once running smoothly, now grinding to a halt. And as trade routes broke down, military and food supplies across the kingdoms quickly plunged into crisis. What is particularly striking is how the tone of these letters shifts over time. In earlier tablets, one finds formal greetings, invitations to exchange gifts, royal marriage negotiations, all reflecting a world of confident, prosperous rulers. But in the final letters from Ugarit, written just before the city was destroyed, that confidence is gone. In its place, panic, pleas for aid, and raw fear. Kings who once saw themselves at the pinnacle of power were reduced to writing desperate appeals, as vulnerable as any commoner. And then one day, Ugarit fell. When archaeologists uncovered these tablets, many were still sitting on the writing tables, never sent. Those final letters, undelivered, remain a vivid testament to a world unraveling. In every line pressed into clay, we can still feel the breath of a dying era. And it was at this very moment that the sea peoples began to emerge from the shadows, as agents, or perhaps as symbols, of the end of that once glorious age. It is hard to imagine that just a few years before those desperate pleas were hastily inscribed onto clay tablets, the cities of the Mediterranean still basked in an atmosphere of rare prosperity and confidence. Ugarit, for example, was not only a bustling seaport but also a major cultural center. In the grand homes of merchants and nobles, fine pottery, gold and silver jewelry, and intricately carved figurines were displayed everywhere. Evidence of a wealthy class that loved beauty and spared no expense in decorating their lives. Merchant ships came and went from the harbor in a constant flow. The markets bustled with silk, spices, colored glass, and precious metals from across the known world. On the walls, skilled artisans depicted images of gods and ancient legends, their art reflecting a vibrant, self-assured culture. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, was no less magnificent. Its temples and massive gates were built from colossal stone blocks adorned with detailed carvings. In the palaces, scribes carefully recorded treaties and significant events, as if time and history were theirs to command. To the west, in the Mycenaean city-states, the aristocracy's life revolved around grand palaces, where vivid frescoes covered the walls, portraying hunting scenes, rituals, and daring sea voyages. Mycenaean warriors, clad in gleaming bronze armor, paraded in festivals, proudly honoring the strength and traditions of their people. Even ordinary citizens, though not wealthy, benefited from this prosperous, globally connected economy. They wore finer fabrics, used better household goods, and had access to luxury items once reserved for the elite. In religious ceremonies, solemn processions continued as usual. Priests offered the finest goods to the gods, not only to seek blessings, but also to display their city's wealth and power. And above all, what people likely felt most deeply was a profound faith in the stability of their world order. Kings proudly carved their victories and distant treaties into stone. Merchants eagerly invested in long sea voyages. People lived with the belief that their world, and with all its complexity and brilliance, would endure for generations to come. No one imagined that in just a few short years it would all be reduced to ash. Mighty fortresses would burn. Trade routes would be severed. The joyful sounds of festivals would be replaced by desperate cries echoing across the land. And so, when we read those final letters from Ugarit, or when we stand among the ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa today, we see more than broken stone and shattered walls. We feel a deep and lingering sorrow for a world that once gleamed with confidence and life, now reduced to little more than faint echoes of a bygone age. Amid the dazzling scene we've just painted, the first deep undercurrents began to stir, not through a grand war, but through words etched in stone like a faint warning from the past. The earliest written evidence we have of the Sea Peoples comes from a famous stone monument, the Merneptah Stele, or the Victory Stele of Merneptah, erected around 1207 BCE in Egypt. At the time, Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Rameses II, faced mounting threats on both Egypt's western and eastern borders. In the inscriptions praising his victories, alongside accounts of triumphs over the Libu and Meshwesh tribes in the west, there appears a seemingly small detail, one that would open the door to one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. The inscription reads, "Canaan has been plundered, Ashkelon has been captured, Giza has been seized, Yanoam has ceased to exist, and Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. And the Shurdan, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, those who came from the distant sea, have been defeated, no longer a threat to the land of Egypt." These names, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, would later become key clues as we trace the path of the Sea Peoples. What stands out is how these groups are described. Came from the distant sea, a phrase that is both specific and shrouded in mystery. No earlier Egyptian records had ever mentioned these peoples. They did not belong to the traditional powers Egypt was accustomed to confronting. Modern scholars believe these may have been migrating groups or warrior alliances, appearing for the first time on the historical stage just as climate and social upheavals were intensifying. It's also worth noting that Egyptian kings were highly deliberate in how they recorded their victories. The fact that these unknown groups from the sea were mentioned in an official inscription such as the Merneptah Stele suggests that the conflicts with them were significant enough to warrant inclusion in the annals of history, a sign that the Sea People's presence was no longer a minor occurrence. Moreover, the simultaneous mention of Canaanite cities being destroyed in the same passage indicates that these seaborne groups were not only clashing with Egypt, but were also impacting the wider Mediterranean region, where fragile trade systems and political alliances were already under strain. From these few lines alone, we can already sense a new wave of instability rising, one that even the mighty pharaohs could not ignore. And as we shall see, this was only the beginning. In the years to come, these groups would not limit themselves to coastal raids. They would organize into large migratory forces, bringing with them families, women, children, and their wealth pushing deep into fertile lands, and reshaping the entire political and economic landscape of the region for the century that followed. What was carved into the Merneptah stele still echoes to us across time. A world that once seemed unshakable was on the brink of its greatest upheaval. If the inscriptions on the Merneptah stele were the first warning of the Sea People's presence, then less than 3 decades later, the entire Egyptian world would face the full force of the storm they unleashed. Around 1175 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt entered one of the most decisive battles in its history. A battle we can vividly picture today thanks to the detailed reliefs carved on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple in Thebes. Those images, more than 3,000 years old, still remain, sharp and striking, as if etched only yesterday. And within them, we see clearly, an enormous force from across the sea had arrived, bringing not only warriors, but entire migrating communities, women, children, wagons loaded with possessions, as if they sought not simply to plunder, but to claim new lands for themselves. According to Ramesses III's inscriptions, this coalition of sea peoples included several groups: the Peleset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denaen, and Weshesh, names that remain the subject of much scholarly debate today as researchers continue to search for their true origins. The reliefs show well-equipped sea peoples' fleets with large oared ships and broad sails. Their warriors wear distinctive horned or conical helmets, carry round shields, and wield unfamiliar weapons, clear evidence that they were not disorganized raiders, but a force deliberately prepared for large-scale war. Ramesses III had anticipated this confrontation. He stationed ambush forces along the shores and deployed Egyptian warships across the Nile branches and river mouths, strategic choke points the sea peoples would have to cross to advance inland. When the battle commenced, the sea peoples' ships became trapped in shallow waters, where they were easy targets for Egyptian archers and infantry positioned on both banks. The carved scenes show the sea peoples fighting fiercely, but also depict bodies floating in the river, destroyed ships, and migrants captured or killed. In the inscriptions, Ramesses III boasts of a resounding victory. "Those who came from the sea, I have hurled them back into the sea. They lie scattered upon the sands. None remain to carry word home." Yet behind these triumphant words lies an undeniable truth. This was not a minor raid. It was a desperate, large-scale migration, a clash between Egypt and a massive wave of displaced peoples seeking resettlement rather than mere plunder. Moreover, despite Ramesses III's claim of victory, Egypt was not left unscathed. Egyptian territories in the Levant, long under Egyptian influence, were permanently lost after this crisis. Egypt's international power was significantly diminished, and the domestic economy suffered greatly in the war's aftermath. And this was only one piece of a much larger picture. While Egypt managed to retain some measure of stability, many other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The Sea People's tide continued to sweep across the Mediterranean, leaving behind charred cities and shattered civilizations. As we look upon the reliefs at Medinet Habu today, we see more than just scenes of battle. We witness a pivotal turning point in history, where an old world was beginning to fade and a new, unstable and chaotic order was rising from the ashes. As historians study the surviving records, from the Merneptah stele, from the reliefs at Medinet Habu, and from various scattered textual sources, they have identified a list of names closely associated with the Sea Peoples. These include the Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Cheka, Denyen, and Luka, names that are both strange and haunting, each raising questions that remain unanswered. What is most remarkable is this: not a single text written by the Sea Peoples themselves has ever been found. Everything we know about them comes from the records of those who fought against them, primarily Egypt, a civilization with a long tradition of meticulously documenting its military encounters. Let us take a closer look at these groups. Shurden, often described as elite warriors, distinguished by their horned helmets, fine armor, and round shields. Some scholars suggest they may have connections to the island of Sardinia, where ancient cultural traces show intriguing similarities. But the evidence remains inconclusive. The true origins of the Shurden remain a mystery. Shekelesh, a name that evokes possible links to Sicily, though, as with the Shurden, this connection is speculative and based mainly on linguistic resemblance. No definitive archaeological proof has yet tied them to the island. Peliset, perhaps the group with the clearest historical footprint. Many historians agree that the Peliset were the ancestors of the Philistines, who later settled along the coast of Canaan, founding cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Archaeological evidence shows the arrival of a new culture in this region, one with strong Aegean influences, distinctly different from the native Canaanite culture. Cheka, another group that settled in the Levant, leaving traces in the region of Dor. Yet their original homeland is completely unknown. No one knows where they came from before joining the Sea Peoples' migrations. Denyen, perhaps the most controversial name. Some scholars link them to the Danaoi, an ancient Greek term for the Mycenaeans. If true, it would suggest that among the Sea Peoples were groups originating from Greece, but this remains a hypothesis. Luka, often associated with the region of Lycia in Anatolia, an area with a long history of seafaring and piracy. But were the Luka mentioned in Egyptian texts truly the same as the Lycian people known from later times? That question too remains unanswered. The common thread among all these names is this: we do not know where they truly came from. No ancient map records a kingdom of the Shurden or a territory of the Denyen. No city claims to have been the original homeland of the Peliset before their arrival in Canaan. And no written chronicle from these groups has ever been found. This makes the Sea Peoples an exceptionally elusive phenomenon. Were they independent groups of peoples who banded together by circumstance? Or were they an organized confederation with a shared purpose, migration, and conquest? To this day, historians have no definitive answer. And it is precisely this ambiguity that ensures the story of the Sea Peoples will forever carry the aura of an unsolved mystery, a true piece of forbidden history at the heart of the ancient world. But perhaps what left the strongest impression of the Sea Peoples, both upon the ancient civilizations they encountered and upon us today, was not simply their mysterious names, but their striking warrior imagery preserved in the reliefs, most notably on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple. As one walks through the temple's colonnades, vivid battle scenes unfold before the eye, Egyptian soldiers facing unfamiliar warriors from across the sea, figures markedly different from their traditional enemies, such as the Libu or the Canaanites. The most distinctive feature is their headgear. Many Sea Peoples warriors are depicted wearing helmets with two sharp horns, or at times wide-brimmed helmets with a tall, projecting crest, a style not seen in Egyptian or neighboring military traditions. these helmets were not merely functional. They seem to have carried symbolic meaning, perhaps signifying strength or distinct cultural identity. This detail alone has sparked decades of debate among historians and archaeologists. Were these ceremonial helmets reserved for leaders? Or did they reflect a characteristic warrior tradition shared across various Sea Peoples groups? In addition, we see them carrying round shields, some convex, others flat, often with a metal boss at the center, designed to deflect blows or be used offensively in close combat. This type of shield was common in the Aegean and Anatolian worlds, but relatively unfamiliar to Egyptian soldiers, who typically favored long oval or rectangular shields. As for weaponry, Sea Peoples warriors wielded short, double-edged swords, large daggers, and at times throwing spears. Notably, some reliefs depict them with leaf-shaped swords, a style remarkably similar to weapons found at Mycenaean archaeological sites. This further strengthens the theory of potential links between the Sea Peoples and Aegean cultures. Their attire is also striking. Many warriors are shown wearing short, fringed skirts with bare legs or light footwear. Such clothing allowed for agile movement, ideal for fighting aboard ships or conducting rapid coastal landings. Taken together, these elements created an image of warriors who were unfamiliar and formidable. To the Egyptians, well versed in the arms and tactics of their traditional foes, the Sea Peoples must have appeared both alien and deeply threatening. And it was precisely this difference that reinforced the sense that they came from distant lands, bringing with them a distinct military tradition, not fully integrated with the coastal cultures of the Mediterranean at the time. To this day, archaeologists continue to compare the warrior imagery of the Sea Peoples with artifacts found in Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. Yet no definitive conclusions have been reached. Every detail, the horned helmets, the round shields, the unfamiliar swords, remains a scattered puzzle piece in a portrait still waiting to be completed. When we look at the reliefs of Medinet Habu at the inscriptions of the Merneptah stele, one thing becomes clear. The Sea Peoples were not merely shadows passing through history. They were a force powerful enough to be immortalized on Egyptian stone, and numerous enough to trigger one of the greatest crises of the late Bronze Age. But who were they, really? This is one of the questions that has kept historians debating for over a century. Two main theories have emerged. Were they simply daring bands of pirates, or were they part of a larger organized wave of migration that helped plunge the entire Mediterranean into chaos? The first theory, piracy, is rooted in how Egyptian texts describe their earliest encounters with the Sea Peoples: swift attacks from fast-moving ships, sudden raids along the coast, plundering and withdrawing quickly. These tactics fit well with the style of organized piracy, which was already common in the Mediterranean during antiquity. Furthermore, groups such as the Lucca, connected to Lycia, a region long associated with seafaring warriors and piracy, seem to support this interpretation. But if they were only pirates, why do the reliefs depict women, children, and entire migrating groups, and why, during the major assault under Ramesses III, did the Sea Peoples bring wagons loaded with possessions, livestock, and tents? Clear signs of migration, not mere raiding expeditions. This detail opens the door to the second theory, one now supported by many modern scholars, that the Sea Peoples represented an organized wave of migration born out of profound upheaval across the ancient world. Climate crises, prolonged droughts, devastating earthquakes, and the collapse of trade networks, all of these factors turned once thriving lands into harsh, unsustainable environments. In this context, groups from heavily affected regions, perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, or even farther west, were forced to abandon their homelands, carrying their entire communities in search of new places to settle. Such migrations, when met with resistance from established civilizations, could easily turn violent, transforming into wars and raids. And this may be how the Sea Peoples carved their place in history, not simply as pirates, but as desperate, determined communities willing to fight for their future. Even so, the question remains open. The Sea Peoples may not fit neatly into any single category. They may have been a combination of many different groups, some pirates, some migrants, some professional warriors, some refugees. It is this diversity and complexity that makes the Sea Peoples so elusive and so captivating for anyone drawn to the deeper mysteries of ancient history. To truly understand their nature, we must explore every theory, sift through every archaeological clue, and study every surviving text, a journey that, the deeper we go, reveals that some parts of history are still not ready to give up their secrets. Debates over the true nature of the Sea Peoples may continue, but the consequences they left behind are undeniable. And the city of Ugarit stands as perhaps the most vivid testament to their impact. Situated on the northern coast of the Levant, in what is now modern-day Syria, Ugarit was once one of the greatest commercial centers of the Bronze Age. From here, Ugarit's merchant ships sailed across the Mediterranean, trading copper, tin, cedarwood, colored glass, fine textiles, and countless other luxury goods. The city was not only wealthy, was remarkably advanced. The Ugaritic alphabet, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, was invented here, laying the foundation for the Phoenician script and, ultimately, for many of the world's alphabets. The royal palace of Ugarit was vast, housing hundreds of clay tablets recording commercial transactions, diplomatic treaties, and royal correspondence, documents that have greatly enriched modern historians' understanding of the region's political and economic landscape on the eve of the Sea Peoples' onslaught. But all of that changed in a matter of moments. The final letters of the King of Ugarit, as we saw earlier, clearly reflect the city's growing panic as enemy forces, believed to be the Sea Peoples, closed in. And then Ugarit vanished from history. Modern excavations at the site of Ras Shamra, where Ugarit once stood, reveal a layer of ash and destruction blanketing the entire city. Walls collapsed, brickwork blackened with fire, clay tablets shattered or fused by extreme heat. What is most striking, there is no evidence that Ugarit was ever rebuilt. No new layers of habitation, no signs of recovery. The once prosperous city was abandoned forever after the attack. Archaeologists also found many unfinished clay tablets in kilns, a sign that the assault struck too suddenly for artisans to complete their work. Some diplomatic letters were found still lying on writing tables, never sent. All of this speaks to the sheer ferocity of the destruction Ugarit suffered, and to the helplessness of its ruling powers in the face of the Sea Peoples' tide. With the fall of Ugarit, a vital link in the Mediterranean trade network was severed, and as that link collapsed, the entire interdependent economy of the region shuddered in response. Today, as we gaze upon Ugarit's charred walls and the fragmented remnants of its clay tablets, we cannot help but feel a deep sense of loss. A center of wealth, civilization, and creativity erased in an instant from the flow of history as if it had never existed. And Ugarit was only one of many victims of the Sea Peoples' tide, a wave that continued to surge across the Mediterranean world. If the fall of Ugarit revealed the destructive power the Sea Peoples could unleash upon coastal trade centers, then the story of Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, opens an even more haunting and mysterious chapter. Nestled deep within the Anatolian plateau, Hattusa was once the heart of one of the greatest superpowers of the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire not only controlled vast territories stretching from Anatolia to the Levant, but also stood as Egypt's chief rival in international treaties and warfare. The city of Hattusa was built across a vast expanse, fortified by massive stone walls, monumental carved gates, and grand royal palaces. Within its archives, archaeologists have uncovered more than 30,000 clay tablets, documenting every aspect of Hittite life, law, diplomacy, religion, war. And then, around 1200 to 1190 BCE, Hattusa was suddenly abandoned. Archaeological excavations reveal widespread signs of destruction and fire across the city. But here lies the mystery. There is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples attacked Hattusa. At least, no Egyptian records mention such an assault. Yet the timing is too striking to ignore. The abandonment of Hattusa occurred precisely during the period when the Sea Peoples were sweeping across the Mediterranean, as the international system of alliances and trade crumbled all around them. Some scholars suggest that after devastating coastal centers, the Sea Peoples may have indirectly triggered internal unrest within the already weakened Hittite Empire, an empire reeling from climate crises, drought, and conflicts with mountain tribes. The final royal letters from the Hittite archives carry a desperate tone, filled with pleas for aid sent from the Hittite king to vassals and allies, eerily similar to the final letters from Ugarit we encountered earlier. What is certain is this: Hattusa was never rebuilt after its abandonment. The Hittite Empire, once an equal to Egypt, vanished from the historical map, giving way to an era of chaos in which small kingdoms and migrating peoples came to dominate much of Anatolia. What truly happened in Hattusa's final days? Did the Sea Peoples directly assault the city, or did their broader impact, through the collapse of trade networks and the spread of instability, push the empire into an irreversible crisis? No one can say for sure. But the timing, combined with evidence of broken trade links and a spreading wave of collapse, suggests that the shadow of the Sea Peoples surely loomed over the end of Hattusa, whether by force or by consequence. And that shadow would continue to spread as we follow their trail to other cities of the dying Bronze Age world. As Hattusa lay silent in its ashes, the wave of crisis did not stop in Anatolia. It swept westward across the Aegean Sea and struck at the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the Greek civilization of the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization, renowned for its cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, was one of the Aegean's most powerful commercial and military forces. Its fortified palaces, towering Cyclopean walls, and the countless treasures discovered in royal tombs reveal a society both prosperous and sophisticated. The Mycenaean system of rule centered around great palace complexes, where the king, the one axe, controlled the economy, military, religious rites, and diplomacy. Their trade routes stretched across the Mediterranean, exchanging goods with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. And yet, by the late 13th to early 12th century BCE, one Mycenaean city after another began to fall. At Mycenae, excavations reveal thick layers of ash covering architectural remains, clear signs of an intense, city-wide fire. Granaries, armories, and residential quarters all show evidence of simultaneous destruction. Pylos, one of the largest administrative centers of the Mycenaean world, met a similar fate. At the palace of Nestor, clay administrative tablets were hardened in the blaze, which is why archaeologists can still read them today. Yet, ironically, one of the final tablets records orders to mobilize defensive troops and prepare warships, suggesting the attack came swiftly as the city was still organizing its defenses. At Tiryns, one of the strongest Mycenaean fortresses, we find more of the same: collapsed walls and scorched buildings. The entire palace system, once the backbone of Mycenaean power, collapsed within just a few decades. What is most striking, there are no signs of lasting reconstruction at these sites. The Mycenaean civilization, so dependent on its intricate palace network, was unable to recover. Some scholars argue that this destruction may have been driven by internal unrest or rebellion. But when we compare the timing of the Sea People's campaigns through the Levant and Egypt, and when we consider the royal Mycenaean records concerning naval defences, many believe that the Sea Peoples likely played a major role in the collapse, whether directly or indirectly. Moreover, in the wake of this destruction, the entire Mycenaean world entered a deep decline. The Linear B script, used by the ruling class, vanished. International trade collapsed. City-states fragmented, retreating into isolated, smaller communities. It was from this void that Greece's so-called Dark Age began, a period that would last for centuries, until the Greek world rose again in the archaic and classical eras. As we look upon the charred walls and scorched tablets of Pylos or Mycenae today, it is hard not to shudder. A civilization that once dominated the Aegean, that had challenged the great powers of the mainland, collapsed in a blaze of fire, taking with it the proud palace system that had defined its rule. And though the Sea Peoples are not always clearly named in Greek texts, their shadow remains. An unstoppable wave that swept across everything in its path. While the Mycenaean civilization faded across the Aegean to the east in the land of Canaan, the Sea Peoples left marks that would prove even more lasting than material destruction, deep demographic and cultural changes whose traces can still be seen to this day. Canaan, stretching from the southern coast of the Levant northward toward Byblos, was once a prosperous region. Its cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, Giza, thrived as bustling trade hubs. The Canaanites built a rich culture, trading extensively with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, serving as intermediaries along many of the Mediterranean's great maritime routes. But by the late 13th century BCE, archaeological evidence shows that a powerful wave of change swept through the region. Most notable among the Sea Peoples who settled here were the Peliset, a group that modern scholars almost universally identify as the ancestors of the Philistines, famous in later history. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict the Peliset as one of the primary forces within the Sea People's assault on Egypt. But unlike some other groups, the Peliset were not completely destroyed. A portion of them, after their defeat in Egypt, established permanent settlements along the coastal lands of Canaan. Excavations at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza reveal a new layer of habitation appearing abruptly around 1200 BCE, coinciding perfectly with the Sea People's migrations. What is striking is that the material culture of this new layer is markedly different from that of the native Canaanites. Pottery styles reflect late Mycenaean or Aegean traditions. Architectural forms, burial customs, even dietary patterns all point to a new seafaring population. From this group would emerge the people later known in the Hebrew Bible as the Philistines, key adversaries of the Israelite tribes. The Peliset settlement in Canaan did more than shift the regional balance of power. It reshaped the demographic map of the Levant. The Canaanites did not disappear, but in many coastal areas they were replaced or gradually assimilated by these new settlers. Archaeological evidence shows that the Philistines quickly built a strong economy, restored trade networks, and developed a unique cultural identity, blending their deep maritime origins with local influences. This reveals an important aspect of the Sea People's migrations. They were not solely agents of destruction, they were also builders. Some groups chose to settle, adapt, and contribute to the cultural fabric of the lands they entered, leaving marks that would endure for millennia. And so, while the cities of the Mycenaeans crumbled, while Hattusa and Ugarit became ruins, a new chapter was unfolding in Canaan, a chapter the sea peoples through the Peliset wrote with their very presence upon the land. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the sea peoples' wave of destruction was not the cities left in flames, but the collapse of a network that had once connected the entire ancient world, the intricate trade system of the Bronze Age, now shattered beyond repair. For nearly 2 centuries prior, civilizations across the Mediterranean had built a fledgling global economy, one in which vast maritime and overland trade routes linked Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even regions beyond. Copper and tin, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, flowed through this system. Along with it came cedarwood, gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, fine textiles, wine, oil, and countless other rare and valuable goods. Merchant ships laden with cargo once glided across the Mediterranean like shuttles weaving a vast economic web, keeping the complex palace economies of Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans humming smoothly. But within just a few decades, that network collapsed entirely. Coastal trade routes were blockaded or severed by the fleets of the sea peoples. Once thriving port cities like Ugarit were reduced to ruins. The port of Byblos fell into decline. Alashiya, modern Cyprus, a key supplier of copper, was attacked and thrown into chaos. With the merchant fleets gone, the flow of copper and tin, essential for the production of weapons and tools, came to a halt. This triggered a domino effect. Without bronze, palace economies collapsed, unable to maintain military power or sustain their elite structures. Clay tablets from Ugarit and Pylos reveal that even as destruction loomed, city officials were still desperately trying to organize convoys, request aid, and mobilize their naval forces. But it was all in vain. The trade routes had become too unstable. From that point, the ancient world quickly descended from order into chaos. International alliances unraveled. Diplomatic treaties, once carved in stone as eternal promises, became meaningless as partners either no longer existed or lacked the strength to fulfill their obligations. The palace-based economic system, which relied on a steady inflow of foreign goods, could not survive. Without trade, palaces collapsed. Aristocrats lost their power, artisans found themselves unemployed, populations were forced to revert to subsistence living, roads once bustling with commerce grew silent, warehouses once overflowing with goods stood empty, docks that had once echoed with the voices of merchants were left with crumbling walls and lonely, weathered mooring posts. For this reason, many historians describe this collapse as one of the earliest examples of the failure of globalization. A world once deeply interconnected, seemingly stable, proved astonishingly fragile in the face of sudden upheaval. And when the dust finally settled, the Mediterranean world, as it had been known, was no more. A new order, fragmented, localized, uncertain, arose in its place, ushering in a dark age that would take centuries for humanity to recover from. As the Mediterranean world descended into chaos, the question of the true origins of the sea peoples became ever more urgent for modern researchers. One of the most prominent theories is this: a segment of the Mycenaean population, following the collapse of their civilization, became part of the sea peoples' wave, migrating and raiding across the Mediterranean. This theory arises from several compelling observations. First, as we've seen, between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great Mycenaean palace cities were systematically destroyed. The power structure collapsed, the aristocracy lost its base, and many communities were suddenly cut off from the imported food and goods they had once relied upon. In this environment, many Mycenaean groups were forced to leave their former centers in search of survival. Archaeological evidence shows that after the palace system fell, the population in the Peloponnesian plains declined sharply. Many coastal areas and Aegean islands, once bustling, were abandoned. At the same time, in new regions such as the Levantine coast, a new layer of habitation appeared, bearing clear Aegean cultural traits, particularly in pottery styles, architectural methods, and burial practices. Moreover, the name Denian, appearing in the Sea Peoples list, may be connected to Danaoi, the term later used by the Greeks themselves to describe Mycenaean peoples. This has led many scholars to argue that some displaced Mycenaeans, rather than waiting to perish, joined with other Sea Peoples groups, forming armed migrant bands that fought and sought new lands. Yet this theory faces notable challenges. First, there is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt spoke Greek or bore the distinct symbols of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Second, the cultural diversity among the Sea Peoples was immense, from the horned helmets of the Shurden to the round shields of the Peliset, to weaponry and dress styles that varied greatly between groups. This suggests that if the Mycenaeans were involved, they were but one part of a far more complex alliance, not its dominant force. Furthermore, within Greece itself, archaeology shows that some Mycenaean communities did persist after the crisis, especially in rural areas and on certain islands. If the entire Mycenaean warrior class had transformed into Sea Peoples, such strong cultural continuity within Greece might not have been so apparent. Finally, many researchers caution that equating the Sea Peoples with the Mycenaeans risks oversimplifying what was clearly a very complex phenomenon. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Sea Peoples included a mix of groups from Anatolia, the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Levant. In short, the idea that displaced Mycenaeans contributed to the Sea Peoples wave is well supported, but it also contains gaps and uncertainties. And it is precisely these lingering mysteries that continue to fuel the endless fascination surrounding the Sea Peoples, a chapter of history that, the deeper we study it, reminds us that some answers may still lie just beyond our reach. In the effort to unravel the true nature of the Sea Peoples, a second major theory has drawn considerable attention from modern scholars. Could part of the Sea Peoples wave have been linked to migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorians, tribes moving southward during that time of crisis? This theory is grounded in a series of observations from both archaeology and modern genetic studies. According to researchers, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, waves of migration from the northern Balkans began moving south in earnest. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements in the Danube Valley and across the Balkans experienced major upheavals, likely driven by harsh climate shifts, population pressures, or internal conflicts. Amid this turmoil, various tribal groups began moving through Macedonia, Thessaly, and into southern Greece, among them the group later known as the Dorians. The arrival of the Dorians in southern Greece coincides closely with the collapse of Mycenaean cities. This has led some scholars to ask, could a portion of the Dorians, or other Balkan groups, have joined forces with the Sea Peoples, helping to drive a powerful armed migration across the Mediterranean? Archaeological clues offer intriguing hints. New layers of post-collapse settlement in the Peloponnese reveal sudden changes in architecture, burial practices, and pottery styles, reflecting a culture distinct from earlier Mycenaean traditions. Similarly, along the Levantine coast, certain pottery types and construction techniques appear that bear traits associated with the Balkans or northern Greece. While this evidence is not strong enough to definitively prove that Dorians directly participated in the Sea Peoples, the timing is certainly suggestive. Perhaps most intriguing of all, the rise of ancient DNA research has added new tools to this investigation. Scientists are now analyzing ancient remains from Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. Preliminary results suggest that during the transition after the Bronze Age collapse, there was an increase in genetic markers linked to Balkan populations within southern Greece and in some coastal Levantine communities as well. This raises the possibility that migrating Balkan groups not only entered southern Greece, but that some may have joined seaborne migrations, becoming part of the Sea Peoples wave that so profoundly reshaped the region. Yet, as with all theories, there are important counterpoints. First, the Dorians, according to later Greek tradition, re-established power in southern Greece after the collapse, rather than disappearing. If large numbers of Dorians had transformed into Sea Peoples, their strong cultural presence in later Greek history might not be so evident. Second, the Sea Peoples were a highly diverse coalition. Assigning the Balkans a dominant role risks oversimplifying a phenomenon that clearly included groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. Finally, while genetic research holds great promise, the available ancient DNA samples remain too limited to draw firm conclusions about the scale and role of Balkan groups within the Sea Peoples. Even so, the theory of migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorians, playing a role adds an important dimension to our understanding. It reminds us that the Sea Peoples phenomenon was not a simple, linear event, but the result of multiple, overlapping migrations interacting in complex ways. And it is this very complexity that makes the story of the Sea Peoples so mysterious, so multifaceted, and so endlessly compelling, a puzzle we are still striving to piece together today. After weighing the various theories and the idea of displaced Mycenaeans, the migrations from the Balkans, many modern scholars have reached what is perhaps the most realistic conclusion of all. The Sea Peoples were not a single unified ethnicity, nor a fixed, long-standing alliance. They were likely a temporary coalition formed from many different groups, each with its own motivations, all swept up in the swirling crisis of the era. This theory is supported by a number of compelling observations. First, as we've seen from Egyptian records, particularly the Merneptah stele and the Medinet Habu reliefs, the Sea Peoples are listed as a collection of highly diverse groups: Sherden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jekka, Denian, Luka. None of these groups had a clearly recorded homeland in Egyptian texts. Their military traditions, clothing, and weaponry also varied widely. This led many scholars to ask, if the Sea Peoples were a unified nation, why are their depictions and descriptions so distinct from one another? The most reasonable answer is that the Sea Peoples were likely a loose confederation, formed amid the broader regional collapse. In a world where harsh climate changes, widespread crop failures, earthquakes devastated cities, international trade broke down, great empires grew weak and lost control of their peripheries, countless groups, from displaced farmers, unemployed soldiers, and pirates to desperate migrant bands, may have come together to form mixed, mobile populations moving across the Mediterranean. In this process, loose alliances between these groups likely arose out of pure necessity. Those with superior strength or naval experience would take leadership roles, while others joined in pursuit of new lands, wealth, or simply survival. This would explain why in major campaigns, such as the battles during the reign of Rameses III, the Sea Peoples brought not only warriors but women, children, livestock, and wagons full of belongings. They were not simply pirates, but armed migrant groups with resettlement as one of their ultimate goals. Moreover, archaeological evidence from the Levant shows that the cultural footprints of the Sea Peoples were highly inconsistent. Some sites reflect strong Aegean influence, others Anatolian, and still others a blend with local traditions. This further supports the idea that the Sea Peoples were not a homogeneous bloc, but rather the product of many migrating peoples and forces converging amid the chaos of the time. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of this theory is that it reflects the true, volatile nature of the era. As the old world order collapsed and palace systems failed to protect their populations, people had little choice but to move. And in an age of turmoil, military strength became a critical means of survival. Thus, from a patchwork of disparate groups, a loose Sea Peoples coalition emerged, part fighting force, part refugee wave, seeking places to endure. Such a coalition could dissolve upon reaching new lands or evolve as circumstances changed, which helps explain why their historical traces appear so fragmented and elusive. For this reason, many scholars today view the idea of a temporary hybrid alliance as the most plausible and fitting explanation, and also why the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to resist any final simple answer. Of all the theories surrounding the rise of the Sea Peoples, perhaps the most compelling is the one that centers on climate crisis, because it offers insight not just into the Sea Peoples themselves, but into an entire world that was fracturing at its very foundations. Modern climate studies, combining ice core analysis, tree ring data, lake sediment records, and pollen evidence, show that in the late 13th and throughout the 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a prolonged and severe drought. These drought cycles may have lasted anywhere from 50 to 150 years, deeply impacting the rain-dependent agricultural systems of many regions. In the Levant, sediment cores show sharp declines in rainfall, which in turn led to major drops in wheat and barley production. In Anatolia, tree ring studies from ancient pines reveal years of stunted growth, a clear sign of repeated crop failures. Meanwhile, in regions like the Aegean and the Balkans, with rugged mountainous terrain and limited fertile soil, food shortages would have become even more dire as the climate deteriorated. Against this backdrop, societies that had long depended on trade networks and centralized palace economies began to lose their stability. As food became scarce, prices soared, public unrest grew, and the lower strata of society were pushed toward desperation. With few options left, many groups were forced to abandon their homelands, joining waves of mass migration. Yet migrating through a world where much of the old political order had already collapsed, and where the remaining fertile lands were now concentrated in scattered coastal cities or river valleys, conflict was all but inevitable. Moreover, in such an unstable world, isolated migrant groups could not easily defend themselves. Thus, many chose to band together, forming armed coalitions capable of both protecting their members and seizing resources when necessary. And so, from desperate farming communities, unemployed soldiers, and displaced nomadic peoples, the alliances that became known as the Sea Peoples began to take shape. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not the original cause of the collapse, but a direct consequence of deepening climate and social crises. Yet, as these migrating groups moved across the region, their very presence accelerated the collapse already underway. Cities were destroyed, trade routes severed, farmers driven from their fields, creating a spiraling cycle of violence and displacement. Archaeological evidence strongly supports this interpretation. Destruction layers in cities such as Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos align closely with the known period of extended drought, and in the Levant new populations appear in the archaeological record at precisely the moment when palace networks and trade systems were breaking down. Many scholars today believe that this combination of climate crisis and violent migration was likely the single most powerful driver behind the Sea Peoples phenomenon. A world that had relied on climate stability and the prosperity of trade, once stripped of those foundations, could not help but descend into waves of violence and migration. And in this spiral, the Sea Peoples were neither pure villains nor mere victims, but the most visible symbol of an era coming undone. But the deeper we dig into the story of the Sea Peoples, the more we run up against what may be the greatest wall of uncertainty in the entire mystery. We do not truly know where they came from. Across thousands of clay tablets, countless reliefs, and the written records of ancient civilizations, there's not a single line that clearly speaks of a homeland of the Sea Peoples. No nation is named, no king ever declares himself king of the Sheridan or king of the Peliset. No map from the era marks the territories of these groups. Why is that? Part of the reason lies in the very nature of the surviving historical sources, which come largely from the Egyptians, the ones who fought against the Sea Peoples. Remember, Egypt was one of the few great civilizations to survive the Sea Peoples' storm intact. And the Egyptians had a very particular way of recording history. Every inscription, every stela, every relief was meant to glorify the pharaoh's victories, to reinforce the eternal image of royal power. In that style of recording, enemies were always portrayed as barbaric, stateless, illegitimate, like waves of chaos crashing against the order maintained by the pharaoh. Even the way the Sea Peoples are listed in Egyptian texts reflects this approach. Group names are provided with vague descriptors like "from the sea" or "from foreign lands," without clear geographical references or directional markers. This may well reflect the Egyptians' own lack of true knowledge about the origins of these groups. But it may also have been intentional propaganda, obscuring the identity of the enemy while magnifying the perceived power of the pharaoh. Moreover, the Sea Peoples themselves were not centralized empires with advanced administrative systems. They were loose coalitions of diverse groups, many of them migrants, climate refugees, or displaced communities. By their very nature, they left behind no writing systems, no temples recording their history, no royal chronicles. What survives of them comes only through the records of those who opposed them. And as every historian knows, history is written by the victors. Thus, virtually all that we know about the Sea Peoples today comes through the Egyptian lens, a biased lens, crafted for political purposes and sometimes prone to exaggerate the pharaoh's achievements. Adding to this, many of the regions from which the Sea Peoples may have originated, the Anatolian coasts, the Aegean, various western islands, were themselves devastated during the Bronze Age collapse. Many cities were burned and never rebuilt. Older writing traditions vanished. The potential sources of first-hand history from the homelands of the Sea Peoples simply did not survive. It is this combination of the Egyptian bias in historical recording and the absence of records from the Sea Peoples themselves that has left us with a near impenetrable gap in our understanding. And so, even though the Sea Peoples truly shook the entire Mediterranean world of their time, they remain, and may always remain, shadows in the memory of humanity. A strange wave from the past whose echo we can still hear, but whose true shape we may never fully see. While the original homeland of the Sea Peoples remains an unsolved mystery, their post-collapse journey has left much clearer traces on the historical map. One of the most striking examples is the rise of the Philistines, a group that archaeological evidence shows was directly linked to the Peliset, one of the key contingents of the Sea Peoples. As we saw in the reliefs at Medinet Habu, the Peliset played a major role in the Sea Peoples' assault on Egypt. After their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, part of the Peliset force did not return to the sea. Instead, they settled along the coastal regions of Canaan. It was here, through a gradual process of adaptation and integration, that the distinct Philistine culture emerged, a culture that would shape the political and cultural landscape of the Levant for centuries to come. Archaeological excavations in cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath have provided clear evidence of this transformation. At Ashkelon, for instance, the archaeological layers reveal a new settlement horizon appearing around 1200 BCE, precisely the period when the Sea Peoples are known to have arrived. In particular, archaeologists have found large quantities of late Mycenaean-style pottery, a type of ceramic that was common in the Aegean but rare in Canaan before this period. This suggests that new arrivals brought their cultural traditions from across the sea. At Gaza, architecture and burial customs also point to the presence of a community whose practices differed markedly from those of the native Canaanites. What is especially fascinating is how the early Philistines initially retained many elements of Aegean culture in their everyday objects, architecture, and rituals. Yet, over time, they blended into their new environment, creating a unique hybrid culture that combined seafaring influences with strong local traditions. This evolution is particularly evident at sites like Ashkelon and Ekron, where later Philistine pottery developed its own distinctive style, no longer a mere imitation of Mycenaean forms. From a genetic standpoint, modern DNA analysis has further revealed that early Philistine populations carried genetic markers consistent with Western Mediterranean origins, reinforcing the theory that a segment of the Sea Peoples, specifically the Peliset, played a foundational role in this community. Thus, from what began as a wave of violent migration, the Sea Peoples, or at least some of their groups, transitioned into stable communities that left lasting marks on the historical record. The Philistines would go on to become a significant force in the Levant, frequently clashing with the Israelite tribes, as recorded extensively in the Hebrew Bible, and contributing to the complex political and cultural tapestry of the region. In this way, while most of the other Sea Peoples groups either dissolved or were assimilated, the story of the Philistines shows us that the Sea Peoples did not merely destroy, they also created, and this perhaps stands as one of the clearest examples of how profound crises can forge entirely new orders out of the ruins of the old. After a portion of the Peliset, part of the Sea Peoples wave, settled along the coastal regions of Canaan and formed what would become the Philistine community, one key question has intrigued scholars. Did Philistine material culture truly carry the imprint of Mycenaean civilization? Modern archaeological excavations have provided a very compelling answer. Yes, and in ways both striking and subtle. The most prominent, and most thoroughly studied, evidence comes from pottery. In the earliest Philistine occupation layers at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, archaeologists have uncovered a large volume of pottery in the style of late Mycenaean, particularly Mycenaean IIc. This type of pottery is distinguished by its intricate geometric patterns, spirals, wavy lines, and designs painted in red or black on a light background, a hallmark of Mycenaean artistry at the twilight of the Bronze Age. Crucially, these pottery pieces in Canaan were not imported from Greece. They were made locally, indicating that the artisans who carried this ceramic tradition had physically migrated and were producing their wares in this new land. This points to a genuine movement of people, not merely the spread of trade goods or artistic influence. Architecture also offers intriguing clues. At Ekron, archaeologists have discovered buildings featuring open porch designs, an architectural element with clear parallels in late Mycenaean domestic structures. The kilns and craft workshops unearthed there employed techniques closely resembling those used in Aegean craft centers. Funerary practices provide further evidence. In early Philistine cemeteries, archaeologists found simple pit burials, sometimes accompanied by grave goods that reflected Aegean traditions, in stark contrast to the typical Canaanite practices of collective tombs or rock-cut chambers. Altogether, this evidence paints a vivid picture. In their earliest phase, Philistine culture bore a strong Mycenaean imprint, visible in their pottery, architecture, and ritual life. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Within 2 or 3 generations, Philistine material culture began to evolve significantly. Mycenaean 2C pottery gradually gave way to uniquely Philistine styles, with new shapes and decorative motifs that reflected a blending of influences and local innovation. Architectural forms also began incorporating more Levantine features, and burial practices shifted further toward regional norms. This evolution suggests that the Philistines were not passive bearers of Mycenaean culture. They actively adapted, blended, and reshaped their cultural identity in response to their new environment, forging a distinctive hybrid tradition that honored their roots while embracing the realities of life in Canaan. Today, archaeologists often classify early Philistine culture, circa 1200 to 1150 BCE, as Philistine Phatraries, the phase where the Mycenaean imprint is most visible. Later phases, Philistine II and Philistine III, mark the emergence of a distinctly Philistine identity, more localized and richly adapted to their Levantine setting. In this way, the legacy of the Sea Peoples was not limited to layers of ash and ruins. It also flowed into new cultural currents, leaving lasting imprints that enriched the complex historical tapestry of the Mediterranean. And the Mycenaean legacy within Philistine culture stands as one of the clearest and most fascinating testaments to that complex journey. While the traces of the Peliset, the Sea Peoples group who would become the Philistines, have been brought to light through careful archaeological study, the fate of the other Sea Peoples remains far more obscure. And this is not surprising. As we have seen, the Sea Peoples were not a single, unified ethnic group. They were a loose alliance of disparate tribes and peoples, each with its own origins, its own identity, and its own motivations. And as the Great Bronze Age crisis came to an end, many of these groups, if they were not destroyed in battle, gradually blended into the Mediterranean societies where they settled. Within just a few generations, their distinct identities would have largely dissolved. Names that once rang out from Egyptian inscriptions, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Cheka, Denian, Luka, vanish from the historical record. But this does not mean these peoples vanished entirely. It is far more likely that survivors of these groups were absorbed into local cultures, whether in the lands they had attacked or in the regions where they ultimately settled. Consider a few examples. The Shurdan may have established themselves in the Western Mediterranean. Some scholars suggest they contributed to the warrior culture of Sardinia, where the great stone towers known as nurag still stand today, silent witnesses to an ancient era of upheaval. The Shekelesh, whose name evokes Sicily, may have similarly merged into the island's native communities, their distinct identity gradually fading into the evolving Sicilian culture. The Cheka left perhaps the faintest trace. At the site of Dor and on the modern coast of Israel, archaeologists have uncovered a layer of occupation featuring cultural elements not entirely Canaanite. This may reflect the presence of Cheka settlers, though in time, the local culture once again dominated. The Denian, possibly linked to the Danaoi, a term for Mycenaean Greeks, likely reintegrated into the broader Greek world during its post-collapse migrations and the complex resettlements of Greece's so-called Dark Age. The Luka, associated with the Lycian region of Anatolia, may have blended back into the Anatolian highland communities, persisting under new names and social structures no longer connected to the Sea People's identity recorded by the Egyptians. Across all these cases, the pattern is the same. Once the storm of history had passed and Mediterranean civilizations began to stabilize, the scattered Sea Peoples groups could not maintain distinct identities for long. Without formal administration, without written traditions of their own, and without strong cultural institutions to preserve their identity across generations, Assimilation was inevitable. And when that happened, names like Sheridan, Shekelesh, and Checker faded, leaving only faint echoes on Egyptian stelae and lingering as tantalizing puzzles for future historians. Today, when we trace the legacy of the Sea Peoples, we are not just reading layers of ash and ruins. We are also deciphering blended bloodlines and cultural identities that quietly transformed Mediterranean civilizations from within. And perhaps this is why, even after more than 3,000 years, the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to captivate historians and archaeologists alike. For they represent a wave of history that cannot be easily pinned down, a force of human movement and transformation whose consequences and legacies remain subtly woven into the very fabric of Mediterranean history. And so after tracing every footprint, every layer of ash and every surviving fragment, we can begin to understand why the Sea Peoples have become one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Not because they never existed, on the contrary, their impact is clearly visible in the archaeological layers, in the ruins of fallen cities, in vanished civilizations. Not because there are no records, for Egyptian inscriptions, layers of material in Canaan, the Levant, and the Aegean all tell pieces of their story, but perhaps this is what makes the mystery so compelling. The more evidence we uncover, the more we realize that what we know is only the visible tip of a vast, submerged iceberg. First and foremost, the origins of the Sea Peoples remain elusive. For more than a century, scholars have tried to trace the roots of each group: Peliset, Philistines Sheridan, Sardinia, Shekelesh, Sicily, Denian, Mycenaean, Danaoi, Checker, Lucca, part of Anatolia. And yet no single theory has proven strong enough to achieve universal consensus. Even in Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples are always described as waves of invaders from the sea, from foreign lands. With no nation, no known kings, no recorded capital cities. This made them one of the most shadowy, ungraspable foes that ancient civilizations ever faced. Second, the Sea Peoples left behind no written history of their own. There is no Sea Peoples chronicle, no stela proudly recounting their victories from their perspective, no surviving texts telling their story in their own voice. Everything we know comes from the other side, from Egyptian records, from scattered archaeological traces, from the ruins of civilizations they struck and then vanished from. This ensures that their image remains forever half seen, half unknown. We cannot say with certainty how strong they were, how numerous, how organized, or even whether they were a single, coordinated force or multiple waves of migration layered upon each other. Third, while the Sea Peoples' impact is undeniable, their material legacy is difficult to trace. They helped bring about or accelerate the collapse of many Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittites, fallen; the Mycenaeans, devastated Ugarit, burned many Canaanite cities, conquered or transformed. Yet after the wave had passed, most Sea Peoples groups either merged into local societies or faded from memory. They left behind layers of ash, early ceramic styles showing Aegean influence, but no lasting new civilization that bore the name of the Sea Peoples. Their story is like that of a great wave crashing across history, leaving deep scars in its wake, but the wave itself dissolving before anyone could fully record it. And perhaps it is this very elusiveness that makes the Sea Peoples so endlessly fascinating. We have no shortage of tales about mighty empires with palaces and written chronicles, but the story of the Sea Peoples is the story of outsiders to the official histories, desperate, determined communities whose own voices were never preserved, but who nonetheless reshaped the course of an entire era. And in that very shadowy nature, the Sea Peoples will likely continue to challenge the imagination and patience of scholars, and of all of us, for many centuries to come. But perhaps in this entire journey to understand the Sea Peoples, the most profound question is not who they were, but how history has, or has not, remembered them. For without the inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have known that a wave of Sea Peoples once shook the ancient world. Nearly everything we know about them comes from Egyptian records, from the Merneptah stele, from the carvings in the temple of Medinet Habu under Rameses III. It is from these inscriptions that the names Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Cheker, Denien, Luka were preserved. It is from these reliefs that we see the images of warriors with horned helmets and round shields, and of migrating families, women, children, livestock in tow, moving as part of this great upheaval. Without these records, all the archaeological evidence, the layers of ash at Ugarit, Mycenae, Pylos, the new settlement layer in Canaan, would have remained isolated clues, difficult to connect into a coherent picture of such a vast wave of armed migration. And yet this also reminds us of an essential truth. History is written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm of the Sea Peoples, that recorded this story through its own lens. In the inscriptions, Pharaoh is always the triumphant hero. The Sea Peoples, the barbaric invaders who are defeated. There is no voice from the Sea Peoples themselves, no record of their story as seen through the eyes of those who were forced to abandon their homelands, cross the sea in desperation, and fight to survive. This is what makes the story of the Sea Peoples both fascinating and sobering, for what remains in the historical record is always but one side of a much larger tale. If, one day, a chronicle of the Sea Peoples were to be discovered, assuming one was ever written, the story we know today might look very different. But perhaps that chronicle does not exist. The Sea Peoples, by their very nature, were migrating communities without a strong administrative structure, without an enduring system of record-keeping, and in that sense they are among the lost voices of history. This too is a larger lesson. How many events, how many peoples, how many stories once shook the ancient world, but because no one recorded them from their side, we will never know they existed. The Sea Peoples, by fortune or misfortune, left just enough traces in Egyptian stone for us to follow their story today. But surely many other Sea Peoples in the long human story have been swallowed in complete silence, leaving behind nothing but layers of earth and stone. And perhaps this is what makes the mystery of the Sea Peoples endlessly compelling, for it is not just their story, but a story about how history is recorded, how human memory is preserved, and how many voices have been forgotten along the way. And as our journey reaches the final lines of the story of the Sea Peoples, perhaps an even larger question lingers in the mind. If not for the inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have known that the Sea Peoples had existed. So how many other chapters of human history, how many communities, how many civilizations, how many stories have been completely erased from humanity's memory? The layers of earth we uncover today reveal only the smallest fragments of the past. The written records that remain are the voices of the few civilizations that managed to preserve their history. Behind every carved stone, every broken shard of pottery, every line etched into temple walls, lies a vast ocean of things unknown and perhaps unknowable, and this is why the journey of exploring history never truly ends. For history is not only what we know, it is also what has been forgotten, buried, or never recorded at all. The Sea Peoples offer one of the most vivid examples of this, an anonymous wave that reshaped the political, economic, and cultural map of the entire Mediterranean, and yet whose identity has all but faded into the sands of time. But they are not the only ones. If the Sea Peoples could shake an entire age, and yet today We still do not know who they truly were. How many other stories have been completely lost, leaving no trace in the written records we now possess? Perhaps somewhere in a distant land, beneath layers of earth yet to be unearthed, clues still lie hidden, fragments that could forever change the way we understand the past. And perhaps through conversations like this, through every video and every story we tell, we can help keep these questions alive so that history remains not a closed book, but an ever-open door to new discoveries. If you too feel there is still so much we do not know about the past, if you too wish to continue this journey of exploring forgotten histories and unsolved mysteries, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It will be your way of staying connected to the journeys ahead, to stories that just might change the way you see the human story. Because this journey, like the history it explores, will never truly come to an end.